The air in the scriptorium was thick with the scent of vellum and fear. Ilara, the priory's oldest nun, had caught the boy, Leo, hunched over his illicit artwork. Her knuckles were white where they gripped the flickering taper. Below its trembling light, on a scraped piece of parchment meant for a saint's epistle, was the drawing. It wasn't the lamb or a dove, or even the familiar, stylized serpent of original sin. This creature was magnificent, terrifying, and utterly impossible. A beast with scales like hammered emeralds and eyes that seemed to hold the cold, molten fire of a forge. "Leo," Ilara whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "What have you brought into this holy place?" The question was not about the drawing. It was about the heresy it represented. The year was 1489. The place was the Benedictine Priory of St. Jude on the northern coast of England, a solitary stone sentinel battered by the North Sea gales. It was a world of strict lines, the line between the sacred and the profane, the known and the mystical, and the severe line that separated Brother Thomas's ledger of tithes from Leo's desperate, secret art. Leo wasn't a monk, not yet. At 15, he was an oblate, an apprentice in the scriptorium, destined for the solemn vows if his fervor proved true. His hands, however, were not meant for prayer. They were meant for the meticulous, intoxicating labor of illumination, a trade he possessed a dangerous, unsettling gift for. He could paint the gold leaf around a capital A so that it captured the sun like a saint's halo. He could render the folds of the Virgin Mary's robe with a lifelike grace that seemed miraculous. But his mind was less devoutly disciplined. It was a vast, misty moorland, haunted by things that did not exist in the Holy Scriptures, but lived vividly in the ancient, unwritten tales of the coast, tales whispered by the fishermen who came to the priory gate, trading salted cod for blessed bread. Tales of giants, drowned cities, and dragons. Leo's mentor, Brother Michael, was a man of mild temperament and an appreciation for true artistry, even the slightly impish, decorative flourishes Leo sometimes snuck into the marginalia. But Brother Michael was away, traveling inland to procure expensive blue pigment, ultramarine, from a distant merchant. In his absence, the scriptorium fell under the grim stewardship of Brother Thomas, a pragmatist who saw art only as a servant to accounting and doctrine. Thomas had eyes that missed nothing, and he smelled sin the way a starving man smells bread. This evening, the sin was the dragon. The drawing Ilara discovered was not meant to be found. It was a quick, feverish sketch, born during a lull in copying the Psalms. He had used a fine-point stylus and lamp-black ink on a sheet of scrap vellum. The beast, which he mentally named Viridian, was coiled, its mighty head framed by thorny crests. The detail that had seized Ilara's soul, however, was the eye. He had rendered it with a terrifying intelligence, a slitted pupil that suggested not an animal, but a formidable, malicious intellect. Ilara's gasp finally broke Leo's stunned silence. He snatched the parchment, crushing it in his fist. "It is nothing, sister," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Just a gargoyle study. For the cathedral in Durham, they asked for ideas." It was a clumsy lie. Gargoyles were stone demons, perpetually defeated and grotesque. This creature was not defeated. It looked eternal. Ilara's bony finger trembled as she pointed to the crushed drawing. "The devil takes many forms, child. He offers the gift of great beauty, that you may be seduced by its power. That is not a gargoyle. That is a worm, a serpent of myth and pagan darkness." "It is only ink, sister," Leo insisted, sweat beading on his brow. The scriptorium felt suddenly hot, the stone walls pressing in.
Ink is the vehicle of ideas, Leo, she countered, her eyes narrow and accusing. And those ideas take root in the minds of men, poisoning their faith. The bishop has been writing to us, warning of the spread of old beliefs, of heretical art smuggled from the continent. He calls it a plague of imagination. She didn't confiscate the drawing. Instead, she backed away slowly, her gaze never leaving his face, a silent, chilling accusation in her eyes. Burn it, Leo. Burn it now, and confess your pride to Father Abbot. Let this night's fancy be the last. The moment the door latched behind her, Leo sank onto the oak stool, his heart thudding a savage rhythm against his ribs. He uncurled the vellum. The magnificent viridian was creased, but unharmed. He didn't burn it. He couldn't. It felt like burning a piece of his own soul. Instead, he slipped the drawing into a hollow space he had carved beneath his small, paint-stained box of pigments. The priory was a sanctuary, but as the wind howled outside, sounding like a desperate ancient roar, Leo felt an icy certainty. He had brought a pagan god into the house of the Christian one, and he knew, with the stark terror of a boy who had violated a solemn oath, that this secret would not remain hidden long. The beauty he created and the eternal fire of damnation felt terrifyingly thin.
The true source of Leo's turmoil wasn't just fear of discovery, it was the intoxicating need to draw. The dragon, Viridian, had awakened something that demanded expression. The scriptorium felt stifling, the sanctioned subjects of saints and seraphim suddenly pale and lifeless. Late that afternoon, Leo finally sought his escape. He feigned a need to clean his grinding stone and slipped out of the priory's main buildings, heading toward the coast. The priory was built high upon a shelf of crumbling gray cliffs. The wind here was a constant, deafening roar, and the waves below gnawed tirelessly at the rock. Leo descended a narrow, treacherous path used by the fishermen, finding a small, sheltered cave where the salt spray dampened the walls, but the tide never reached. This was his studio. He brought only a sliver of charcoal, saved from the kitchen fire, and a water bottle. The cave wall was rough, gray sandstone, but in the dim, filtered light, it offered a vast, secret canvas. He didn't draw Viridian. He drew something older, heavier, and more elemental. The folklore he had absorbed from the fishermen whispered of the Knuckaledi, a creature of the sea, a half-man, half-horse monstrosity with flesh flayed and veins pulsing with black blood. It was a beast of pure, terrifying power, the embodiment of the unforgiving northern waves. Leo worked feverishly, the charcoal scratching and whispering against the stone. He didn't try to make it beautiful. He tried to make it real. The Knuckalevi's equine ribs arched with strain, its single hate-filled eye glowed, and the sea spray seemed to drip from its powerful hooves. As he worked, lost in the rhythm of his hand, he heard a sound that was not the wind or the waves. It was a rhythmic, heavy clank, 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 coming from deeper within the cliff face. It was the sound of a pickaxe on rock. His heart leapt. Who else knew of this cave? He wiped his drawing quickly with his soaked cloak, turning the Knuckalevi into a dark, meaningless smudge, and crept toward the sound. The passage narrowed sharply, opening into a larger, cavernous space where the air was warmer and smelled of damp earth and oil. In the center, illuminated by a single caged lantern, was a man. He was massive and bearded, dressed in the thick, mud-stained leather of a quarrier or a miner, not the rough homespun of the local villagers. He was hammering relentlessly at the furthest wall of the cave, his labor slowly excavating a new passage. As the man paused to wipe his brow, he caught sight of Leo. His eyes, though eerie, were sharp and assessing.
He wasn't surprised, only annoyed. "Lost, boy?" the man growled, his voice deep and gravelly. He had a faint, non-local accent, perhaps from the industrial towns in the south. Leo swallowed, clutching the charcoal. I was just looking for shells. Who are you?" The man smiled, a brief, unsettling flash of teeth in the dim light. "They call me Master Gwillem, and I am here at the bishop's pleasure, boy. I am looking for what lies beneath St. Jude's, something they say has been sleeping here since before the Danes." He gestured to the wall he was chipping away at, where a dark, square patch of rough-hewn stone was beginning to show beneath the natural rock. "And what is that?" Leo whispered, mesmerized by the stone. "A foundation, or perhaps even a door. Now run along, oblate. You'll dirty your white fingers here, and you'll see things that might trouble a mind still trying to believe in angels." Leo left quickly, the charcoal pressing into his palm. The sight of the miner and his cryptic mission did not soothe his fear, but replaced it with a new, burning curiosity. The priory was guarding a secret deeper and older than its Catholic faith. And the bishop, through Gwillem, was now digging to find it. Leo looked back at the smeared wall, the ghost of the Knuckleheavy still visible. He had brought the forbidden into the light, only to discover that the priory itself was built on a hidden darkness. The encounter with Master Gwillem left Leo rattled. The scriptorium now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage perched over a terrifying secret. Brother Thomas, ever vigilant, noticed the change in the oblate. Leo was jumpy, his work suffering from hasty, less than perfect strokes. "Your hand trembles, Leo," Brother Thomas observed, hovering over a sheet of vellum. "A lack of spiritual discipline always manifests as an imprecision of the craft. Are you fasting enough? Are your prayers fervent?" Leo stammered, "Yes, brother. It is the cold, perhaps. The sea air is sharp." Brother Thomas's gaze, flat and colorless, lingered on the box where Leo kept his colors and his secret drawing. "The cold does not afflict the soul, boy. Sin does. Remember the fate of Icarus. Ambition without humility ends in a fall." That night, unable to sleep, Leo slipped out of his pallet in the novice's dormitory. He couldn't shake Gwillem's words. "I am looking for what lies beneath St. Jude's." Leo knew the layout of the priory intimately. He knew that the oldest, deepest part of the structure was the crypt, located beneath the main altar. The crypt was used only for burial and was sealed by a massive iron-bound door, the key to which was kept in the abbot's private study. The abbot, Father Silas, was a scholar, deeply entrenched in his Latin texts and mercifully distant from the day-to-day policing of the priory. He was also a man of habit. Using a thin piece of worked copper wire, a tool he usually reserved for scraping away botched ink, he picked the lock to the abbot's study. The tumblers clicked softly, and he slipped inside, illuminated only by a sliver of weak moonlight filtering through the high window.
The room smelled of old parchment and beeswax. Leo moved straight to the abbot's desk. Beneath a stack of theological treatises, he found it, a single, heavy key, made of tarnished copper, much older than any other key in the priory. It had an oddly shaped bit, intricately carved, unlike the simple iron keys of the modern locks. His hands shook as he lifted it. This wasn't the key to a pantry or a cell. This felt like the key to the priory's past. He made his way through the darkened, echoing halls to the main chapel. The sanctuary was vast and silent, dominated by the high altar. Behind the altar, concealed by a heavy velvet curtain, was the crypt door. The copper key, cold and heavy, fit the ancient lock with a soft, decisive thunk. He turned it. The mechanism groaned,
a sound that seemed to carry through the massive stone structure. He pushed the door inward. A rush of air, damp and musty, escaped, smelling of earth, dust, and something indescribably metallic, almost sulphurous. He lit a small taper. The crypt was a circular chamber, its vaulted ceilings supported by thick, squat columns. Along the walls were stone sarcophagi of long-dead founders and benefactors. But his eyes were drawn immediately to the center of the room. Here, the stone floor had been disturbed. A square section, perhaps 6 feet across, had been meticulously cut and replaced, the lines of fresh mortar still visible. It was crude, messy work, certainly not the work of the priory stonemasons. It was Gwillim's handiwork. He held the taper low. The stonework had been removed and then reset, but not perfectly. A small, dark gap remained where the stones met the surrounding floor. Leo knelt and peered into the slit. He couldn't see far, but the light of his taper caught something that made him gasp, an elaborate carving on the vertical side of the stone block. It wasn't Christian. It wasn't a cross or a dove. It was a serpent coiled around a staff, but this serpent possessed a head more akin to a predatory bird, sharp-beaked and feathered, and it was surrounded by strange runic characters, unlike any Latin script he knew. As Leo traced the foreign symbol with his finger, he felt the stone shift slightly beneath his touch. He realized the square section wasn't simply a patch. It was a trap door, perfectly sized to be the entrance to the shaft Gwillim was digging in the cave below. Just as the realization dawned on him, a heavy cough echoed from the nave above. Brother Thomas. The sound was close, deliberate. The monk had heard the door groan or smelled the burning tallow of the taper. Leo blew out the flame instantly, plunged into total darkness. He clutched the copper key, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was trapped between the bishop's secret below and Brother Thomas's relentless suspicion above. Leo froze in the absolute darkness. He held his breath, listening. The cough he'd heard was followed by the low, measured clack-clack of Brother Thomas's wooden rosary beads. Thomas wasn't just in the nave. He was approaching the high altar, presumably for a late-night vigil or a check of the silver cruets. Leo knew he couldn't hide in the crypt. The copper key was still in his hand, and the door was only slightly ajar, enough to allow a beam of moonlight to strike the polished stone floor outside. Thinking fast, Leo pressed his back against the cool stone wall just inside the entrance. He remembered a trick he'd learned from the older monks. When you moved in the dark, you moved with the drafts and echoes, not against them. Brother Thomas's heavy footsteps paused right outside the door. He heard a faint sniffing sound, confirming Thomas had caught the scent of the burned tallow. "Father Abbot?" Thomas's voice was a low, measured rumble, entirely devoid of the aggressive zeal he usually displayed. "Is someone in the crypt?" This was Leo's chance. He couldn't answer, but he could move. He took 2 silent, careful steps into the nave, keeping his body low to the ground and out of the faint line of moonlight. He quickly and gently swung the crypt door shut, pushing it just enough so the latch caught without the loud thunk of the bolt. He held the key and ran, not toward the scriptorium, but toward the abbot's study. Thomas, hearing the slight, almost imperceptible click of the closing door, likely assumed the abbot, or perhaps a senior monk, had been down checking on a burial vault and had just left. The monk hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, then moved away from the altar, heading toward the sacristy. Leo reached the abbot's study, his lungs burning. He replaced the copper key beneath the stack of treatises exactly as he had found it. He closed the study door and leaned against it, allowing a wave of dizziness to pass. The immediate crisis was averted, but the seed of dread had taken root. He knew too much. He had seen the serpent runes, the sign of something ancient and non-Christian, buried beneath the very heart of the priory. Back in the dormitory, he slipped beneath his rough wool blanket, shivering not from the cold, but from the realization that his forbidden drawings were connected to the priory's hidden history. A new commission. The next morning, a reprieve arrived in the most unexpected form. A rider from the bishop's palace arrived at St. Jude's bearing a sealed document and a heavy, purse-sized sack.
The document was a special high-priority commission from the bishop himself, an illuminated manuscript detailing the history and lineage of a newly appointed baron in the region. The illustrations needed to be rich, vibrant, and unique, a show of prestige. And the bishop had specifically requested the services of the young oblate Leo, whose gifts with gold leaf and color are unmatched. Leo stared at the parchment, stunned. This was his dream, a high-profile professional commission. It meant prestige, a large sum for the priory, and most importantly, it meant Brother Thomas couldn't touch him. His art was now protected by the bishop's personal request. Thomas, standing beside him, was a statue of barely contained fury. "A mistake has been made," he hissed to the abbot. "The boy is undisciplined and prone to flights of fancy." Father Silas, rubbing his tired eyes, simply waved him away. "The bishop's word is law, Brother Thomas. Let the boy work. The gold in this sack pays for a year of our candles. Supervise him, yes, but do not hinder the work." Leo felt a surge of adrenaline, not just from relief, but from the power of his talent. His artistry, the very thing that made him vulnerable to charges of heresy, was now his shield. He was given a small, separate cell in the scriptorium for the commissioned work, a place of relative privacy. As he unpacked the bishop's luxurious pigments, real vermilion, deep indigo, and even a small vial of precious ultramarine, his eye fell on his hidden dragon drawing, Viridian. He looked at the bishop's commission, a series of ornate coats of arms and noble portraits. He thought of the bishop's secret door and the serpent rune. If his art was his shield, perhaps it could also be his weapon of inquiry. Maybe he didn't need to risk going back to the crypt. Maybe he could hide the forbidden, the heretical truth, not under the floor, but in plain sight within the bishop's own book. Leo's new cell was a small triumph. It was away from the main bustle of the scriptorium, which meant fewer prying eyes. More importantly, the bishop's commission required magnification, a specialized technique of using tiny, detailed brushes, which discouraged anyone, even the zealous Brother Thomas, from peering too closely at his work for fear of damaging the delicate vellum. His task was to illustrate the lineage of Baron Hugh of Kelden, a man whose ancestry, Leo knew from the local whispers, was as muddy and questionable as the winter roads. The commissioned work was meant to solidify this lineage, to give it the weight of history and divine approval. Leo began with the approved designs, flourishing vines, the Baron's official coat of arms, 3 simple silver trout on a field of blue, and standard portraits of grim-faced ancestors. But in the margins, the unapproved work began. The microscopic heresy. Leo realized that a dragon, drawn in the scale and style of Viridian, was too large, too obvious. He had to think smaller, more cunningly. He started with the illuminated capital letters. The E that began the Baron's history, exalted as the lineage, was his first target. While the main body of the E was filled with customary gold scrolls, Leo used a brush the width of a single hair to hide his secret. In the swirling gold of the lowest horizontal bar, he painted a microscopic coiled serpent. It was only visible if one held the page at a precise angle to the light, and even then it looked like a complex flaw in the gold leaf. But its structure was unmistakable. The serpentine body and the sharp avian head he had copied from the crypt's trapdoor. The runic serpent. Next came the portraits,
The Baron's purported great-grandfather was said to have slain a great serpent in the marshes. The accompanying illustration showed the man triumphantly standing over a dead, harmless water snake. Leo added 2 elements. The scales. He used a subtle technique called punching on the surface of the vellum to give the appearance of rough, angular texture around the dead snake's head. When studied closely, this texture formed the distinct geometric scale pattern of Virigian the dragon. The eyes. In the eyes of the great-grandfather, Leo mixed his pigments with lamp-black soot to give the irises a peculiar vertical slit, the slitted, predatory eye of a dragon, suggesting that the supposedly holy lineage of the Baron in fact was rooted in the forbidden, pagan power of the earth, the same power that the bishop was secretly digging for. The danger of inspection. Brother Thomas, suspicious but restrained by the bishop's order, eventually requested an inspection of the initial pages. He entered Leo's cell, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "Let me see this glory that so distracts your soul," he commanded, extending his hand. Leo presented the page, his heart hammering in his chest. "It is the opening page, brother. I have only completed the initial capital and the dedication. Please be careful of the gold. It is still binding." Thomas took the page and held it up, scrutinizing the work. He looked for obvious flaws, an incorrect color, a smudge, an error in the Latin. He held it close, examining the gold. His breath hitched slightly as his eye caught the microscopic detail in the golden E. He brought his face inches from the vellum. "What is this? A spot of dirt? Did you mix your binder properly?" "I shall scrape it immediately." Thomas hesitated. Scraping the gold might ruin the entire letter, a costly mistake that would reflect badly on his supervision. If it was just a tiny flaw, he didn't want to be the one who damaged the bishop's project. He handed the page back with a sneer. "Clean it, but understand this, boy. The eyes of the faithful see all. Your talents do not grant you impunity. If I find any deviation from the sacred or the approved history, I will not hesitate to deliver you to the bishop myself." Thomas left, believing he had intimidated the young oblate. Leo, however, didn't scrape the gold. He picked up his fine-point stylus and, using the microscopic scale, traced the final tiny lines of the serpent's crown. He had passed the first test. His hidden heresy was safe, concealed beneath the cloak of professional genius. He was now sending messages straight into the heart of the powerful men trying to bury the truth.
The bishop's commission, while a shield, was also a relentless taskmaster. Leo worked for days, his back aching, his eyes burning from the microscopic work. He was embedding tiny pagan details into every border, every scroll, every flourish of the official history. The process fueled his spirit, but drained his energy. He knew he had to understand the runic serpent he had copied from the crypt door. Without context, his rebellious drawings were just accidents or flourishes. With context, they became undeniable evidence of a buried truth. The only scholar in the priory with knowledge of languages beyond standard Latin and Greek was Brother Elias. Elias was an old, reclusive monk, long relegated to the damp, dusty archives as a sort of gentle penance for an unnamed intellectual indiscretion committed decades ago. He was forgotten by most, but Leo knew he was the key. One cold evening, Leo sought out the archives, a silent, cavernous space where centuries of moldering parchment resided. It smelled powerfully of mildew and dry ink. He found Brother Elias hunched over a huge bound volume, his face illuminated by a single, sputtering tallow candle. "Brother Elias," Leo whispered, "I require your wisdom." Elias looked up, his eyes magnified by thick, chipped lenses. He smiled faintly, a man who rarely received visitors. Ah, the young artist! What arcane knowledge does the bishop's commission require now? The correct number of tassels on a baron's shield? No, brother, Leo said, pulling out a scrap of parchment. On it, he had meticulously drawn the runic characters that surrounded the serpent on the crypt door. He'd made it look like a casual practice sketch. I found this in a discarded fragment of old vellum. It seems to be a curious script. Do you recognize it? Brother Elias took the sketch, his aged fingers trembling slightly as they touched the drawing. He stared at the runes, his face shifting from curiosity to a deep, unsettling familiarity. "Dear heavens," he whispered, pushing his spectacles higher up his nose. "This is not Latin. It is not even Old Saxon, though it shares elements." He led Leo to a specific shelf and pulled down a crumbling, worm-eaten manuscript, a forbidden text that had survived only because it was hidden among dull legal briefs. "This is the language of the Prifdrag," Elias murmured, translating the word with quiet reverence. "The great dragon." Leo felt a chill, confirming his worst, most exhilarating fears. The name sounded like a low, rolling thunder. Elias explained, "This is a fragment of the ancient tongue of the Britons, before the Romans, before the Christians. They believed the island was built upon the bodies of two great forces, the white dragon and the red dragon. They were not evil demons, Leo. They were the earth's power, the wellspring of prophecy and natural magic." He pointed to the central rune Leo had drawn, the coiled serpent with the feathered raptor head. "This symbol, it is the key rune of binding. It doesn't just represent the great dragon. It represents the promise, or the threat, that the dragon is sleeping, sealed away by a great spell or covenant." Leo's mind raced. Gwillem was digging for what lay beneath St. Jude's. The crypt door was the key rune of binding. The priory wasn't just built over ancient power. It was built to contain it. Why would anyone seal away the earth's power, brother? Elias looked around nervously, lowering his voice until it was barely a breath. Because when the church came, it did not merely supplant the old gods, it imprisoned them. They turned the source of prophecy into the source of heresy. Look at your drawing, boy. This rune is a warning. It says, "He who opens this seal will unleash the fire of the earth." Just as the old monk finished his sentence, the archive door creaked open. Standing in the doorway, framed by the faint light of the corridor, was Brother Thomas. His eyes were immediately drawn to the forbidden text open on the table and the crude drawing of the ancient runes clutched in Brother Elias's hand. Brother Thomas said, his voice dangerously soft, "What unholy texts are you sharing with the oblate? And what, pray tell, is that pagan scribbling?" Thomas advanced into the room, his gaze fixed on the incriminating parchment and the terrified face of the old scholar. Leo knew this was a far greater danger than the close call in the crypt. Thomas had just caught them in the very act of studying heresy. The archives instantly became a court of judgment. Brother Thomas's face, usually pale, was flushed crimson with righteous fury. He lunged toward the table, his hand outstretched for the forbidden text and the sketch of the runes. Leo acted on instinct, protecting the most valuable thing, the knowledge. He slammed his hand down on the sketch, crushing the delicate parchment. "It is my fault, Brother Thomas," he cried, his voice deliberately loud and distressed. "I was struggling with the script for the Baron's charter. I saw Brother Elias's candle and thought he might help me with a misspelled word." He slid the runic sketch under the sprawling, dense, and perfectly legitimate pages of the Baron's history, camouflaging it instantly. Thomas ignored Leo and grabbed the ancient forbidden manuscript. "And this, oblate, did you require knowledge of the damned and the pagan to spell Amen?" He slammed the book on the table, sending up a cloud of old dust. Brother Elias, normally timid, found a surprising reserve of defiance. He pushed his spectacles up and spoke with a quiet, scholarly conviction. "It is a philological text, Brother Thomas, a study of ancient local dialects. The bishop himself commissioned a census of all unusual texts 5 years ago. I was simply verifying its contents, as is my duty." This was a masterful lie. Thomas knew the bishop's commission list was immense and often forgotten, but the book was undeniable. "Lies and vanity," he roared. "This is the poison of curiosity. This is the wellspring of the heretical art the bishop warned us of." He did not want to risk being delayed or counter-argued. He grabbed the book and hauled it toward the iron stove used to heat the small archive space. "The only census this book requires is of ash and smoke." Leo watched in horror as Thomas forced the dry ancient vellum into the small stove opening. The paper caught instantly, roaring to life. The pages, holding centuries of pre-Christian lore and the only context for the runes, turned to glowing embers. "No!" Elias cried, a genuine sound of mourning, but Thomas blocked his path. "Silence! This is penance for your intellectual pride, Brother Elias. And you, oblate, your curiosity has now caused the destruction of holy, if outdated, property. You are confined to your cell, no food, no further communication until I have decided your penance." Thomas didn't take the sketch. He assumed the forbidden knowledge was now gone, consumed by the flames. He hadn't seen Leo hide the drawing. He was too focused on the spectacular destruction of the book.
The message in the smoke. Leo was marched back to his cell, shaken but relieved. Elias was safe, and the runic sketch, the key rune of binding, was hidden under the Baron's charter. Confined to his cell, Leo was forced to confront the depth of the conspiracy. The priory didn't just contain ancient secrets. The church was actively destroying the evidence of its existence. Elias's knowledge was gone, but the word he had shared, Prithdrag, the great dragon, remained burned into Leo's memory. As the sun set, a junior oblate silently slid a mug of cold water and a hard crust of bread under Leo's door, a sign of sympathy for the hungry young artist. Leo, desperate to process the night's revelations, picked up his fine-point stylus and the bishop's vellum. He couldn't draw the runes openly, but he could draw the consequences. He began the illustration for the Baron's battle standard. It was meant to be a simple, fluttering banner. Instead, Leo drew the banner twisted and torn. In the background, in the sky above the battle, he used the finest red and black inks to draw a towering pillar of smoke and fire rising from the earth itself. And within that smoke, visible only in the density of the ink, he drew the faint ephemeral shape of a vast, winged serpentine creature, the Prithdrag, finally unleashed. It was a warning and the prophecy, hidden in the bishop's own commissioned book. Leo's penance, confinement to his cell and only bread and water, was a superficial punishment. In truth, it was a profound opportunity. Brother Thomas had unintentionally isolated the oblate, granting him the very solitude he needed to work and think without interruption. He spent the next 2 days furiously working on the bishop's commission, hiding the Prithdrag prophecy deeper and deeper within the illustrations. The fire he drew in the sky became so intricate that it looked like a stylized cloud formation, the dragon hidden in the swirling pigment. His mind, however, was focused entirely on Master Gwillem and the impending breach of the key rune of binding. Gwillem was digging not just for a secret, but for a prison wall. The secret drop. Leo needed to know how close Gwillem was to finishing the job. He couldn't risk going back to the cave, nor could he enter the crypt again, as Thomas was likely watching it.
He had to use the one resource available to him, the priory's drainage system. The latrines and wash basins of the scriptorium emptied into a stone shaft that ran down the cliff face before dispersing into the sea. Leo knew this shaft passed very close to the natural cavern where Gwillem was working. He needed a spy. He found an abandoned spool of thick, oiled linen thread, saved from the bookbinding supplies. Attached to the end of the thread, he tied a simple, heavy object, a copper crucifix worn smooth by years of handling. He wrapped the crucifix in a small, oiled piece of parchment. On the parchment, he wrote only two things: a rough sketch of the runic serpent, the key rune of binding, and a single word, written in his perfect calligraphy in the local common tongue: stop. Late that night, under the cover of a fierce sea storm that muffled all sounds, Leo lifted a heavy stone cover of the drainage shaft in his cell's tiny washing area. He lowered the thread slowly, spooling out line, until he estimated he had reached the cave level, approximately 50 feet down the cliff face. He pulled the thread back up slightly, then let it dangle, hoping the wind and the angle would swing the small package close enough to Gwillem's camp to be seen. It was an act of desperation, relying entirely on luck and the miner's innate curiosity. The miner's discovery. The next morning, Leo awoke to the sound of something he hadn't heard in days. Silence. The incessant, rhythmic clank, clank, clank of Gwillem's pickaxe was gone. Had he finished? Had he broken the seal? Leo was summoned by Father Abbot. He entered the abbot's study, expecting more reprimand, but found the abbot pacing anxiously, his face etched with worry. "Leo," the abbot said, his voice strained, "the miner, Master Gwillem, he has departed." "Departed, Father?" "In haste. He came to me before dawn. He was pale and agitated. He claimed he found something unstable, a fissure, he called it, in the rock face near the sea. He said the work was too dangerous to continue without more men and better equipment." The abbot gestured to a small, heavy leather pouch on his desk. He took only portion of his pay and left this, a peculiar stone he claimed was part of the unstable rock. He asked me to send it to the bishop as a warning. Leo looked at the stone. It was not gray sandstone. It was a shard of something black and glassy, veined with a strange, dull red metal. It looked like cooled lava or obsidian, an impossibility on the northern coast. Then Leo saw the truth in the abbot's words. Gwillem hadn't stopped because of instability. Gwillem had found the warning. He had seen Leo's crucifix and the key rune of binding, and whatever he had chipped through, represented by the black fiery stone, had frightened him enough to heed the warning and flee. Leo had successfully stalled the bishop's operation. The great dragon was still sealed. However, the abbot's final words chilled him to the bone. He also mentioned, quite cryptically, that the work required a key he could not find, and that the key rune of binding he spoke of was not painted on the wall, but drawn on a scroll. Leo's heart plummeted. Gwillem hadn't just seen the drawing. He knew Leo was the one who drew the runes, and he'd confirmed its existence to the abbot, placing the burden of the secret squarely back on the priory.
Father Abbot Silas was not a zealot like Brother Thomas, but a man of books and order. Gwillem's cryptic parting words about a key and a scroll concerned him deeply, not for their spiritual danger, but for the threat they posed to the priory's temporal security and reputation. He dismissed Leo, but summoned him again later that day, sending a servant to retrieve him after evening prayer. This time, the meeting was in the small private library, far from the eavesdropping ears of Brother Thomas. The air was heavy with anxiety. "Leo,"
the abbot began, not unkindly. "I have not forgotten your presence in the archives with Brother Elias. Now this miner speaks of a key rune drawn on a scroll. He implies that someone within St. Jude's knows the secret of this door." The abbot placed the piece of black glassy obsidian Gwillem had left behind on the table. It pulsed dully in the lamplight. "Gwillem's discovery confirms an ancient legend that has been dismissed as folklore for centuries. St. Jude's was not built upon a natural cliff, Leo. It was built to serve as a seal, the priory's true foundation." The abbot leaned in, his eyes wide. "Long ago, a sect of scholars seeking to pacify the violent nature of the island's earth spirit, what they called the Privdrag, built a church over its supposed resting place. They used Christian ritual to maintain a pagan prison. The crypt door is not merely an entrance to the tombs, it is the outermost lock." He then showed Leo an old, water-damaged map of the priory. On it, drawn in faded red ink beneath the structure, was a massive, coiled shape. "The key Gwillem spoke of is not for the iron door, but for a mechanism deep inside the cliff. And the scroll, the design Gwillem described, is a map, a diagram of unbinding, that shows how the key is to be used." Leo suddenly understood the copper key he had held in the crypt. It was ancient, intricately shaped, and felt charged with history. "Father," Leo whispered, "I know the scroll, or its symbol. It is the coiled serpent with the feathered head, the key rune of binding." The abbot nodded gravely. "A symbol of containment. Gwillem's work, the bishop's work, was not to seal the power, but to access it." "Why, Father?" "Power, Leo, ultimate power. The legend states that the dragon's essence grants a terrifying, unassailable authority to the one who controls it. In his greed for dominance over the rival bishoprics, our bishop seeks to become a prophet king." The abbot sighed, the weight of his office crushing him. "Brother Thomas, of course, believes he is protecting the bishop from heresy, but he is merely a shovel for the bishop's ambition." The final warning. The abbot looked at Leo, a mix of fear and strange respect in his eyes. "Gwillem now knows that the knowledge of the diagram exists within these walls. He will report this to the bishop, who will ride here personally. His arrival is now imminent, and he will search everything." The abbot did the unthinkable. He reached into his robes and pulled out a small rolled-up piece of vellum, old, brittle, and stained. "This is not the full diagram, but a fragment, a key index detailing the sequence of the dragon's release. I have kept it, not to use, but to prevent its use." He handed the vellum to Leo. "You, boy, are an artist. You can hide things in plain sight. Brother Thomas suspects you of drawing forbidden things, but he will not suspect you of guarding them. You are the only one with the skill to keep this out of the bishop's hands." Leo carefully took the scroll. It felt warm, almost humming with ancient energy. The abbot had just entrusted the fate of the priory, and perhaps the region, to the boy who drew dragons. "Father," Leo asked, clutching the secret, "where is the key?" The abbot looked at the ceiling, then the floor, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "The copper key for the deep lock? I do not know. It has been lost for many years. It was never kept in my study. Only the outer iron key was." Leo swallowed, the enormity of the abbot's mistake crashing over him. The true key of unbinding was not secured. It was missing. The abbot's confession and the revelation of the diagram of unbinding fragment placed a terrible burden on Leo. The bishop was due within days, and his arrival would signal a brutal, systematic search. Leo had to hide the diagram and find the missing copper key. The artist's vault. Leo went straight to his cell, clutching the fragment of the diagram. It contained ancient symbols and sequences that detailed the process of unbinding the priv drag. He couldn't burn it, and he couldn't simply bury it. He had to hide it where it would be overlooked by zealots, but preserved by artists. His hiding place was his masterpiece, the bishop's commission itself. The vellum pages of the baron's history were thick and carefully prepared. Using a specialized razor-thin scraper he usually employed to correct large mistakes, Leo carefully peeled back a tiny section of the vellum's backing layer on the final page, the page he'd already stained with the prophecy of the dragon's fire. He unrolled the diagram fragment, cut it into 4 tiny strips, and, using a thin layer of clear egg white glue, the binder for his paints, he affixed the strips to the underside of the vellum. Then he smoothed the backing layer perfectly back into place. The scroll was now literally part of the bishop's own holy and prestigious book. Only by destroying the commission would one retrieve the heresy, a destruction the bishop would never permit. The missing key. With the diagram secure, Leo turned his attention to the missing key. The abbot knew it was lost, but Brother Thomas believed it was the simple, large iron crypt key kept in the abbot's study. Leo knew the copper key, the true key, was ancient and special. He remembered a conversation years ago with Brother Michael, his mentor, while working in the priory's oldest, dustiest storage space, a place filled with discarded relics and broken statues. Michael had once pointed to an old wooden statue, a depiction of St. Jude himself, carved centuries ago, with a hollow, serene smile. Before the bronze key was made for the treasury, the oldest, heaviest treasures were guarded by St. Jude's silence. A silent saint makes a good sentry.
Leo slipped back into the storage room. The statue of St. Jude stood against the back wall, half hidden by moth-eaten vestments. Leo ran his hands over the base, searching for a hidden seam or catch, but found nothing. He then felt the head, running his fingers over the carved eyes and mouth. The wood was solid. He remembered the silence part. St. Jude was the patron saint of lost causes and the patron of the priory. Leo took a heavy bookbinding hammer and, bracing himself for the sacrilege, gently tapped the saint's wooden mouth. A sharp crack echoed. A small, thin piece of wood, expertly glued to represent the saint's lower lip, fell away, revealing a hollow space within the statue's head. Inside, resting on a bed of dry moss, was the copper key. It was the same intricately cut, strangely shaped key Leo had held briefly that terrifying night in the crypt. It was the key of unbinding. Confrontation at the gates. Leo took the key and ran back to the scriptorium. He hid the key not in his cell, but wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tucked deep into the gargoyle carving on the roof gutter outside his window, a secret place only an artist would dare to look. He returned to his cell just as the priory bells began to clang frantically. A junior oblate burst through the scriptorium doors, breathless. The bishop has arrived, and he has brought the royal inquisition with him." Leo looked out the window. Down in the courtyard, a retinue of horses and men was dismounting. Leading them was the bishop, a tall, imposing figure whose black robes seemed to drink the light. But beside him were 3 grim, cloaked men, the inquisitors, whose presence meant the bishop wasn't here for a routine visit. He was here for judgment. And the first person the bishop's guards demanded to see was the young man who had been drawing forbidden things, Leo, the oblate artist. The confrontation has arrived. Leo is now facing the highest authority of the church, with the fate of the priory and the sleeping dragon resting on his ability to deceive and deflect.
Here is chapter 11. The Boy Who Drew Dragons, chapter 11. The Inquisitor's Gaze. The bishop's arrival was less a visit and more an invasion. His guards, dressed in the livery of a powerful lord, secured the gates, and the 3 silent inquisitors, led by a gaunt, terrifying man named Father Alaric, immediately set up a tribunal in the abbot's common room. Leo was brought before them, still wearing his paint-stained oblate robes. Brother Thomas stood stiffly to the side, his face a mask of smug anticipation, ready to testify to Leo's heretical inclinations. The interrogation. The bishop himself did not speak at first. He let Father Alaric take the lead. Alaric had the cold, clinical voice of a scholar who had traded compassion for logic. "Leo of St. Jude's," Alaric began, tapping his fingers on the table, "you have been entrusted with a sacred task, the illumination of the Baron's history. Yet we have reports that your mind is filled with pagan phantoms, serpents, worms, and creatures born of unholy folklore." Brother Thomas stepped forward. "I found him consorting with Brother Elias, who was known to study forbidden texts of the old tongue. And I have seen the strange light in his eyes, the fever for creatures that defy God's creation." Leo knew he couldn't deny the drawings or his presence in the archives. He had to reframe his motivation. "My lords, I confess my curiosity," Leo said, kneeling and keeping his voice respectful but firm. "But Brother Thomas misunderstands the heart of my work. My gift is not pride, it is preparation." He rose and gestured to a large framed tapestry on the wall, depicting St. Michael slaying a magnificent bat-winged devil. "My faith requires that I know the devil's face so that I may properly defy it. How can I draw the triumph of the Christian man," Leo argued passionately, "if I do not know the true terror of the adversary? My sketches of serpents and giants were studies for the great enemy, so that my finished work, sacred, would be even more glorious in its divine message." He turned to the bishop. "The church has asked me to illustrate nobility, but the greatest battle is against sin. I sought to understand the darkest, fiercest forms of evil, so that the light of the gospel, when I paint it, would shine all the brighter." This argument struck a chord. The inquisitors were scholars of doctrine. The idea of knowing the enemy to better defeat him was a classic theological defense. The Book of Prophecy. Father Alaric inquisitively leaned forward. "We shall judge you by your completed work, not your words. Bring the Baron's charter." The bishop's finished commission was brought in. It was a stunning piece of art, pages gleaming with gold leaf and vibrant pigments. Alaric began scrutinizing the pages, looking for a misplaced symbol, a hidden heresy. His sharp eyes caught the microscopic detail in the golden E, the texture of dragon scales in the portrait of the ancestor, but Leo's defense had worked. Alaric saw them as stylistic choices, not secret worship. The scales were merely rough texture. The slitted eyes were an artistic attempt to convey the ancestor's fierce determination. Then he turned to the final page, the one Leo had used to hide the diagram of unbinding and stain with the prophecy of the dragon's fire. "And this," Alaric said, pointing to the twisted banner and the swirling pillar of fire in the sky, "this strange dark cloud above the battle scene, what is its meaning?" "That, Lord Inquisitor," Leo declared, "is my final and most earnest warning."
"That, Lord Inquisitor," Leo declared, "is my final and most earnest warning." He explained that the black cloud was not pagan fire, but the uncontrolled rage of the sinful man. The twisted banner was the unstable nature of earthly power, a direct and safe critique of the baron's questionable lineage. He even pointed out the faint, ephemeral shape of the privedrag in the smoke. I painted the demon fleeing, vanquished by the righteous struggle of the Christian man. It is a victory banner, Lord Inquisitor, not a prophecy of doom. The bishop, who had remained silent, finally spoke, his voice heavy with authority. The quality of the art is beyond reproach. It is indeed a grand commission, perfect for my purpose. The artist has shown zeal, perhaps misguided, but dedicated to the glory of God. He overruled the inquisitors, not because he believed Leo, but because the book was too valuable to destroy, and Leo's defense was clever enough to protect his own reputation. The key's discovery. The interrogation was over, but the search was not. However, the bishop commanded, due to the security concerns raised by the minor Gwillem, I order a full search of the priory. Every nook, every cell, and every piece of art must be checked for the scroll or diagram that Gwillem spoke of. Leo's heart hammered. The diagram was safe in the book, but the copper key was still hidden in the gargoyle outside his window. Just as the guards began to move, Brother Thomas, bitter at his failure to condemn Leo, had one last desperate effort. He marched straight to Leo's vacated cell. He reached up, felt along the cold stone gutter outside the window, searching for any hidden cache or crevice, and his hand closed around the oil-wrapped copper key. Thomas held the key aloft, his eyes blazing with triumph. "My Lord Bishop, I have found it! The key to the priory's secret! The oblate is a spy!" The bishop and the inquisitors spun around. Leo froze. The game was up.